It was a Tuesday morning, quiet the way Tuesday mornings usually are. I was still in my robe, standing in the hallway with a cup of coffee in my hand, not quite awake yet, just moving through the familiar motions of a morning that was supposed to be like every other morning. And then I heard a voice in my kitchen that I did not recognize. Not a visitor's voice, not the brief, bright sound of someone stopping by. It was a comfortable voice, an at-home voice. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has already decided they are settled somewhere. I stood in that hallway for a moment longer than I should have. I remember the coffee was warm against my palms. I remember the light coming through the window at the end of the hall, the same light that has come through that window for 32 years. And I remember thinking, very quietly, that something had already changed before I had any chance to agree to it. Let me tell you a little about who I am and where I was standing when all of this happened. I am a woman in my early 60s. I was married for 34 years to a man I loved deeply, and I lost him 3 years ago after a long illness that neither of us handled as gracefully as we would have liked, but that we got through together, the way we got through everything. His name was Raymond, and the house I live in, the house I am still living in, was ours. Every wall, every corner, every creaking floorboard in the hallway. 32 years of meals and arguments and laughter and silence. 32 years of a life that still lives in the walls of that place, whether anyone can see it or not. After Raymond passed, I stayed. Of course I stayed. Where else would I go? This was my home. It still is. My son's name is Daniel. He is 31 years old, and I love him with the particular kind of love that only mothers understand, the kind that doesn't ask to be explained and doesn't need to be earned. It is simply there, steady, even when the relationship around it gets complicated. And ours had gotten complicated, especially after his father died. Grief is strange. It does not always bring people together the way we hope it will. Sometimes it creates distance that nobody planned for and nobody knows quite how to close. Daniel and I had been circling each other carefully for 2 years. Loving each other, yes, but also being careful, stepping around things we hadn't found words for yet. So when he called and asked if he could move back home for a while, to save money, to get back on his feet, to figure some things out, I said yes before he had even finished the sentence, because that is what I wanted. I wanted my son back in the house. I wanted to hear footsteps that weren't mine. I wanted to cook for someone again. I said yes, and I meant it completely. He arrived on a Friday. I had made up his old room. I had stocked the kitchen with things I knew he liked. I was, I'll admit it, happy in a way I hadn't been in a while. And then on Sunday, more suitcases appeared in the front hallway. Suitcases I did not recognize. Pink, with a pattern I had never seen before. I looked at them for a moment. Then I looked at Daniel. He introduced her the way you introduce someone who is already part of the plan, casually, lightly, with the ease of someone who does not expect to be questioned. Her name was Melissa. She was polite. She smiled at me and said it was so nice to finally meet me, and I believed that she meant it. I smiled back. I said hello. I said it was nice to meet her too. And then I turned around and walked quietly back to my room and sat down on the edge of my bed. And I thought about what had just happened. He had not asked me. There had been no conversation, no phone call beforehand, no moment where he said, "Mom, I'd like to bring someone with me. Would that be okay?" None of that. The decision had been made somewhere else between the two of them, and I had been informed of it by the arrival of pink suitcases in my own hallway. I sat on that bed for a long time that night. I was not angry, not exactly. What I felt was more like a slow, settling realization. My son had offered something that he had not stopped to ask himself whether it was actually his to offer, and I had let him walk through the door without saying a word. The first few days were manageable. Melissa kept to herself mostly. She was pleasant enough at meals. Daniel seemed lighter, happier, and I told myself that was enough, that I could adjust, that this was temporary and I was good at making room for people. But then small things began to shift. It started in the kitchen. A drawer that had been organized a certain way for 15 years was rearranged. Not emptied, not ruined, just rearranged. Into a way that made sense to someone else. My wooden spoons moved to a different spot. The shelf where I kept my teas cleared to one side to make room for a row of things I did not recognize. I moved my things back the first time without saying anything. I told myself it was not worth making an issue of. Then she moved them again. I left them where she put them. After that, it was the kitchen table arrangement, then a chair in the living room that had sat in the same corner since Raymond and I bought it together at a little shop we found on a road trip in 2003. It was moved to the opposite wall. A lamp was unplugged and set aside to make the space feel more open, I suppose. A few of my framed photographs were shifted to make room for something else. Each change was small. None of them, individually, would have sounded like much if I had tried to explain them to someone. But together, day by day, they added up to something that I felt in my chest every morning when I walked through the rooms I had lived in for 3 decades. I was being slowly edited out of my own home. And what made it harder was Daniel. Because he had begun to speak to me differently. Nothing cruel, nothing that I could point to and say, "There, that is the moment." It was a tone, a manner, the way you speak to someone when you have, without realizing it, placed them in a role they did not choose. He would walk through the kitchen while I was cooking and mention that they were planning to eat at a certain time, as if I needed to work around their schedule. He would reference their space and their evenings in ways that made me feel like a variable to be accounted for rather than the person whose home this was. One evening at dinner, Melissa made a comment, offhand, conversational, not said with any obvious edge, about how the place had good bones and how it would be interesting to eventually update some of the rooms, give it a more modern feel. Daniel laughed, agreed with her. I sat across from them and said nothing. I picked up my fork and kept eating, but something inside me had gone very still. The following weekend, I walked through my own house and felt at every turn like a guest. The living room in the evenings had taken on a different feeling, full of their things, their shows on the television, their rhythm. I found myself drifting to my room earlier and earlier each night, not because I was tired, but because I no longer felt easy in the other rooms. That was when I understood that something was genuinely wrong. And then Daniel pulled me aside one afternoon, gently, carefully. He said he wanted to talk to me about something. He said he hoped I understood. He said, "And I will remember this for the rest of my life." He asked whether I could give them a bit more space in the evenings, specifically the living room. He said Melissa felt a little uncomfortable, and he just wanted to make sure everyone was happy. I looked at my son for a moment. This man I had raised, this man whose father and I had given everything to, and I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, whose house he believed this was. He looked at me with an expression that was not unkind, but was certain. Like the answer was so obvious it almost did not need saying. That look told me everything. And something shifted inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly the way a door closes when the latch finally catches. The following Monday morning, I got dressed, got into my car, and drove to the office of my attorney. His name is Gerald, and he is a calm, steady man who has handled our family's legal matters for many years. He was the one who sat with me through Raymond's estate. He knows this family's history. I told the receptionist I did not have an appointment, but that I needed to speak with Gerald if at all possible. She made a call. He came out to meet me himself. I sat across from him, and I told him what I needed. I asked to review the deed to the house, the will, and every document connected to the property. He pulled the file. We sat together and went through it carefully. The house was fully in my name. It had been since before Raymond passed. In the months before he died, when he was still well enough to make decisions and sign documents, he had transferred the property entirely into my name. He had done it deliberately. He had spoken with Gerald about it and made sure it was properly recorded and protected. My son had never asked about any of this. He had never checked. He had simply assumed, the way people sometimes assume things that feel obvious to them, that the house existed in some shared general way that meant it was available to him to offer as he chose. He was wrong. I sat in Gerald's office for a long time after we finished reviewing the documents. Gerald did not rush me. He sat with his hands folded on the desk and let me have the time I needed. I was not angry sitting there. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to assume that what I felt in that moment was anger, or some kind of satisfaction at having proof of something. It was neither of those things. What I felt was clarity. A quiet, clean kind of clarity that I had not felt in a long time. Raymond had thought about this. In all the difficulty and fear of those final months, he had thought about me, about this house, about what I would need when he was gone. He had taken a careful step to make sure I was protected, even from things neither of us could have predicted. I drove home that afternoon and did not say anything to Daniel. Not that day. Not the next day either. Instead, I began to write things down. Not a list of grievances, not a plan for confrontation, just a record. A quiet, private account of what this house was, what it had meant, what had happened since Daniel arrived, and where I actually stood. I wrote it for myself because I needed to see it clearly before I could speak it out loud. And as I wrote, something else became clear to me. I had been making myself smaller. Not because I was afraid of my son, not because I lacked the words, but because I had slipped into an old habit. The habit of keeping the peace at my own expense, of smoothing things over before they needed to be said, of deciding that someone else's comfort mattered more than my own clarity. I had been doing it for weeks without fully realizing it. The house was mine, and I had been retreating through it like a visitor. That needed to change. I asked Daniel to sit with me on a Wednesday evening. I waited until Melissa had gone upstairs. I made 2 cups of tea, and I set them on the kitchen table, and I asked him to come and sit down. He came into the kitchen with that slightly careful expression he had been wearing with me for weeks, half affectionate, half braced for something. I had the deed in my hand, not held up, not thrust at him. I simply set it on the table between us, the way you set down something that belongs in a conversation. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. I started talking. Not about what had happened in the past few weeks, not right away. I started with the house itself. I told him things he had never known, things Raymond and I had never thought to sit down and explain because they were our private history, not his. I told him about the year we almost lost the house when Daniel was 7 years old and how Raymond had worked double shifts for 11 months to keep it. I told him about the documents Raymond had signed in the last year of his life, what they meant and why his father had chosen to do it. I told him about Gerald and about the afternoon I had spent in that office. I watched my son's face as I spoke. I watched it move through several things. Confusion at first, then the beginning of understanding, then something harder to look at. Something closer to shame. I told him I was not asking Melissa to leave. I want to be clear about that because that was never what this was about. I was not angry at her. She had walked into a situation that had been framed for her in a way that was not accurate. That was not her fault. What I told Daniel was that I needed him to understand where he actually stood, what he had actually done. Not with cruelty. I did not say it with cruelty, but with honesty, that I should have offered weeks earlier and had not, because I had been too busy trying to keep everything comfortable for everyone except myself. The conversation was long. There were moments that were difficult. There were things said that had been waiting to be said for longer than just that week, things that went back to the months after Raymond passed, to the distance that had grown between us, to the ways we had both avoided the harder conversations because grief had made us careful with each other in ways that had quietly become walls. But we stayed at that table. We kept talking. And at some point, Daniel put his head down, and when he lifted it again, he apologized. Not a quick apology, not the kind you offer to move past something, a real one. He apologized for that week, for the space he had asked me to give up in my own home, for the way he had spoken to me. And then he apologized for things further back, for disappearing into his own grief in ways that had left me alone in mine, for assuming in so many small ways over so many months that I was fine because I never said I wasn't. I reached across the table and I held his hand, and I told him I was not telling him this to hurt him. I was telling him because I was his mother, and because I loved him, and because we had been losing each other slowly and quietly, and I was not willing to let that continue. A few days later, Melissa and I spoke. It was brief. There was no dramatic clearing of the air, nothing like that. But there was honesty. She told me she had not realized, and I believed her. She was not a difficult person. She had simply been given a version of the situation that was not complete. She and I were not suddenly close after that conversation, but we were honest, and that was more than I had expected. The house felt different after all of that. Not fixed. I would not use that word. Nothing that real is ever fixed quickly, but clearer. The way a room feels after you have opened a window that had been closed for too long. Some mornings I still walk through these rooms and I feel Raymond, not in a sad way and not in a way that I need anyone to understand or explain. I just feel the shape of the life we built here, still present in the walls, in the light through the hall window, in the chair that has been moved back to its corner where it belongs. He chose to protect this place. He chose to protect me. And I understand now, more than I did before, exactly what he was thinking when he did it. Daniel is still here. We are rebuilding something. Not just the small practical thing about the house, something larger than that. The relationship that had been quietly falling apart before any of this happened. We eat breakfast together now some mornings. We talk the way we used to talk before Raymond died and we both got so careful with each other. It is slow, but it is real. Melissa is still here too. We are not close, but we are respectful. And honestly, that is fine. That is enough for now. I am not bitter. I want to say that plainly because this kind of story can sound bitter when it is told, and I am genuinely not. I am more settled than I have been in a long time. Something that needed to be named was named. Something that needed to be seen was seen. And I am still standing in the house that my husband and I built our life in, and it still belongs to me. And I am not drifting through it anymore. What I learned through all of this, and I have thought about it many times since, is that a home is not simply a structure. It is not just walls and furniture and a deed in a file cabinet. It carries memory. It carries the intention of people who loved you and thought carefully about your future, even when they were running out of time to do so. Every decision Raymond made in those final months is still here, still present, still looking out for me. I almost let all of it slip away without realizing what I was doing. Not because I was weak. I do not think I was weak. I think I was tired and grieving in ways I had not fully admitted to myself. And I had fallen into the habit of making myself smaller so that the people around me could feel larger. It is a habit that many of us learn very early and spend a very long time unlearning. I was unlearning it in my own kitchen, in my own living room, in the house that has held 32 years of my life. And the moment I remembered who I was inside these walls, really remembered it, everything that needed to happen, happened. I remember now, and I will not forget again.